The life of a queen. For many, it seems like an ultimate dream, sitting in luxury on a throne, with a real king as your husband, and your days filled with nothing but entertainment. But was the life of past queens truly so easy and pleasant? Why were handsome princes so rare? Is it true that royal births were public spectacles? And how did a mother-in-law drive an Austrian empress to madness? Why did young Queen Victoria eat only bread and tea in her childhood and couldn't see other people? And was the profession of a queen truly deadly? Let's dive into the reality to understand what the lives of queens in previous eras were really like. A harsh royal childhood. To become a queen, one had to either inherit the throne or marry a king. In either case, preparation for this role began in infancy. A future queen was expected to be educated and well-mannered, preferably from a good, or even better, a royal family. In the Middle Ages, this often meant that upbringing didn't take place in a cozy family home, but in a monastery. If you think school or university life is tough, imagine a monastery. Though some royal children were educated at court, for instance, King Louis IX himself taught his daughter Isabella, the future Queen of Navarre. However, all of this pales in comparison to how Queen Victoria was educated in the 19th century, the very grandmother of Europe, whose name defined an entire era. Her childhood was spent in complete isolation under the severe Kensington system, designed specifically for her. The princess was forbidden from interacting with outsiders. Fed bread and milk and pastries were strictly prohibited, as it was believed that rich foods, butter, and jam provoked sensuality. Meat was a rare treat. Little Victoria vowed in her childhood that when she grew up, she would eat meat every day, and she diligently kept that vow throughout her life. New beautiful dresses were only sewn when the old ones were literally worn to shreds. Add to this a strict daily routine, not a minute of idleness, constant adult supervision, and not a single peer nearby. This is how the future queen's childhood passed. Even at 18, when she ascended the British throne, Victoria continued to sleep in the same room as her mother. The queen hated this system of upbringing her entire life. Burdensome marriages and unattractive princes. Congratulations! Your upbringing and education are behind you, and you are marrying a charming prince who will soon become an equally charming king, and you, a queen. In reality, however, princes and even kings were rarely handsome. Due to centuries of close familial ties among European royal houses, inbreeding and genetic disorders were common. The most unattractive monarch of the past, without a doubt, was Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler in Spain. His frightening appearance was the result of 16 generations of consanguineous marriages. His father was his mother's uncle. The poor king was disabled. He only began to walk independently at 8 years old, struggled to speak coherently, and couldn't chew food properly. Yet he was married twice. The first queen to luckily marry him was the niece of the Sun King, Marie-Louise of Orléans. Despite his physical infirmity, the king was madly in love with his wife, and she inspired him to attend to state affairs. Unfortunately, the queen died without leaving an heir. He was forced to marry a second time, but this marriage was filled with mutual hatred until his death. Another example is Charles VII, another of the most unattractive monarchs. However, his wife, Marie of Anjou, can hardly be called a beauty either. Their pairing is considered the ugliest royal couple in history. It's important to remember that court painters always tried to flatter their crown subjects. Charles VII also had a young mistress, an acknowledged beauty who, incidentally, introduced the fashion of appearing at court with one breast exposed. Charles VII's eldest son, Louis XI, who became king after his father, was even more unappealing. He was so unattractive that he ordered his portraits to be painted only in profile. It's unlikely his young bride, Margaret of Scotland, who was a refined soul, dreamy and fond of poetry, envisioned such a husband. Louis was not only unattractive, but also pragmatic and crude. His wife's romantic nature irritated him. The poor girl died of pneumonia before her 22nd birthday. Such were the charming princes. Royal births, a public spectacle. The queen's primary duty was to give birth to heirs as quickly as possible, preferably several, given the high infant mortality rates of those years. And here queens faced a much harder ordeal than common women. The very act of childbirth, seemingly a deeply intimate process, transformed into a grand spectacle for the entire court in the early modern period. Up to 200 people would gather to witness it. And they didn't just attend. They observed the entire process from beginning to end, without the slightest hint of modesty. The first wife of the Sun King, Louis XIV, Queen Marie-Thérèse, was by nature a very modest and shy woman. Can you imagine what she felt when her labor contractions began, and at that very moment, a crowd of courtiers swarmed into her chambers? No one was concerned about the birthing mother's condition, how terrified or pained she was, especially with such a throng. The reason for the significant presence of courtiers was to ensure that the royal baby wouldn't be swapped. For instance, a desired boy slipped in instead of a born girl. Incidentally, when Queen Marie-Thérèse was dying, her last words were, "Since I am a queen, I have only had one happy day." She didn't specify which day. A similar situation occurred in the 18th century when another French queen, Marie Antoinette, who would later become a victim of the French Revolution, was giving birth. 200 people gathered to watch. When the baby's head appeared and the doctor exclaimed, "The queen is giving birth," hundreds of courtiers rushed into her darkened room with such force that the king even ordered the tapestries to be secured with strong cords so they wouldn't fall on the unfortunate birthing mother. People clambered onto furniture, craning their necks to not miss the moment of birth. The poor queen simply fainted from it all. Lives under scrutiny and constant travel. A queen's private life was strictly regulated. Unlike common women, they didn't enjoy as much freedom. In the Middle Ages, queens were celebrated as models of morality that all noble ladies were expected to emulate. A queen was not allowed to look a man in the face unless he was her husband, the king. And even during ceremonies, she had to look straight ahead and graciously greet everyone she met, without shooting glances around. A queen could not engage in arguments or quarrels in society, otherwise she would lose authority and be deemed immoral. But what would truly surprise you is the daily life of kings and queens during the time of Charlemagne, or, say, English monarchs in the 14th century. It certainly didn't consist of lavish balls and receptions in palaces, as it did in later centuries. Rather, it resembled a traveling circus. The king-queen, their children, from the age of 8, and a huge retinue, knights, scribes, and servants, constantly journeyed through the royal lands, stopping for 1 or 2 nights in castles, noblemen's homes, or monasteries. They toured their domains to display their grandeur to their subjects across the country. Moreover, maintaining the king's large retinue placed an extremely heavy burden on the inhabitants of any area where they lingered for too long. So, queens traveled extensively. They moved on horseback or in carriages piled high with soft velvet cushions. However, this didn't prevent the unavoidable shaking when traveling on rough dirt roads. In later periods, poor queens had to endure unbearable odors and drafts, for example, in the magnificent Versailles. Love, madness, and the crown's deadly peril. You might ask, were there no handsome monarchs who also loved each other? Of course there were such stories. Edward III was utterly devoted to Philippa of Hainaut. Louis the Lion adored the noble Blanche of Castile, and Henry Tudor fell forever in love with Elizabeth of York. But was simple familial happiness accessible to queens? The famous Empress Elizabeth, or affectionately known as Sisi, hailed as the most beautiful queen in Europe, married for love, and Emperor Franz Joseph was also madly in love with her. It seemed like a true fairy tale. But the young couple's happy life in the palace was ruined by an overbearing mother-in-law. The young empress had to clear all her actions and words with her, and the mother-in-law had no desire to share her son, the emperor, with anyone. The beautiful Sisi found herself literally trapped in a gilded cage. The formidable mother-in-law disapproved of her dislike for courtly conventions, forbidding shopping trips and excursions to the countryside. And her husband was constantly preoccupied with state affairs and never contradicted his mother. As a result, the mother-in-law literally drove the empress insane. She even took Sisi's children away as soon as they were born. Persecuted by her mother-in-law, Sisi sought refuge in her private apartments, and her health began to suffer. The beautiful empress suffered from loneliness and depression. Soon, she was even sent to Italy, ostensibly for treatment. The profession of queen proved deadly for the wives of English King Henry VIII Tudor. The vibrant, intelligent beauty Anne Boleyn struggled for a long time to become Queen of England. For her sake, the king even initiated a church reform to obtain a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. However, the happiness of being Queen of England brought her no joy. 3 years later, she was accused of treason against the king and beheaded. The accusations were likely unfair, as just 10 days after Anne's execution, Henry married her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. She was queen for only a year, bore him a son, Edward, and died from childbirth. Incidentally, this is the same Edward who would later bequeath the crown to our Jane Grey. Henry chose his next wife, Anne of Cleves, almost from a photograph, that is, a portrait. But alas, it turned out the artist had greatly flattered the bride. The king did marry her, but after 6 months the couple separated. The next holder of the coveted title of Queen of England was Anne Boleyn's cousin, Catherine Howard. The king was by then old and overweight, weighing about 140 kilograms, but he fell deeply in love with the young beauty. However, she too was accused of treason and executed. And frankly, one can understand the girl. Her married life seems to have been unhappy. Jane Grey, queen for 9 days. Let's return to our young English intellectual who was forced to become queen. Lady Jane Grey, Queen of England, is scarcely mentioned in most history textbooks. She was never meant to be queen, being fourth in line to the throne. From childhood, her greatest passion was her own intellectual development and self-improvement. Jane lived in an era after the Reformation when aristocratic women finally gained the opportunity to engage not only in childbearing and household management, but also in self-education. This period saw the rise of many brilliant, highly educated women. But Jane Grey stood out even among these intellectuals. She mastered Latin, Greek, French, and Italian in her childhood, then learned Spanish, Old Babylonian, Hebrew, and Arabic. She was very close to King Edward VI, her contemporary, the same one from Mark Twain's The Prince and the Pauper. This 16-year-old king died and named her as his successor. When Lady Jane was informed that she was now queen, she fainted, not from joy, but rather from horror. It took time to persuade Jane to accept a crown she never sought, as she was perfectly content with her life as a noble aristocrat. When finally convinced, she stood and declared to the assembled lords that if it was her destiny to reign, she prayed for God's blessing to rule the country for his glory and for the benefit of her people. 4 days after Edward VI's death, Jane Grey Dudley was proclaimed Queen of England. But the deceased king's elder sister, Mary Tudor, had no intention of giving up and also proclaimed herself queen by right of succession. She gathered an army to march on London and seize the usurped throne by force, gaining popular support. She was a fervent Catholic, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, King Henry VIII's first wife. When it became clear that Mary Tudor would indeed take her rightful place on the throne, Jane Grey was betrayed by everyone: the Privy Council, the courtiers, her own family. When Jane's father informed her that she was no longer queen, the girl sighed with relief. She had been on the throne for only 9 days. Mary Tudor, who would go down in history as Bloody Mary, the most hated ruler of Britain, first executed Jane Grey's young husband, ensuring that Jane could witness it from her cell, and then ordered her own beheading. The 17-year-old queen, a victim of this Game of Thrones, was so calm and steadfast in that moment that the executioner, according to legend, asked her forgiveness for what he was about to do. Jane said, "Good people, I am come hither to die." The plot against Her Majesty the Queen was an unlawful act, but it was not done by me, nor did I desire it. In history, she remains known as the 9 Days Queen. Bloody Mary's reign lasted 5 years. Throughout that time, London's prisons were so overcrowded that all the city's churches had to be converted into dungeons. Unfortunately, we will never know what might have happened if the 17-year-old Jane Grey, one of the most intelligent women of her era, had remained on the throne, instead of being stripped of her power. What do you think about these lesser-known pages of history?